I'm Dr. Berry. I'm a Virginia based psychologist, and here I share legal and entertainment news from a psychological perspective. So, this is a little bit of an older case compared to some of the other cases that I've been covering. I never got to covering Wade Wilson or Sean Finnegan. Those are two individuals who were both convicted of intentionally unaliving someone. And for you all that know, y'all know why I have to use that language at first. The details of the case are really horrific, and I'm not going to go into all of the specifics, but there were psychologists and a psychiatrist that talked in Wade Wilson's hearing about were there any mitigating factors for why he shouldn't get the death penalty. And I wanted to break some of that down a little bit more. So, Wade Wilson is 30 years old, and he was found guilty of two counts of first degree capital M after it, and what he did was brutal. So, it's 35-year-old Christine Melton and 43-year-old Diane Ruiz. And I believe these things happened back in 2019. Wilson had met Melton at a bar, and then like I said, the details are just really, really bad. And he did have a history of substance use that could complicate some of his clinical feature. For me, the biggest thing that I saw from him was antisocial personality disorder. And with antisocial personality, the individual has no regard for others. And at its most extreme, because all personality, all diagnoses come on a spectrum. And Lisa, I agree. He really um uh, gives a real big ick for me. Yes, and his face did not look the way that it looks now. He has gotten more and more tattoos. He added swastikas and, like, so he's done more and more to make himself look more and more menacing. I will share that Dr. G Explains did cover his behavior in some of his, like, hearings and during his trial, especially when he did get the death penalty. Dr. G Explains covered that, and I thought he did a really good job from that behavioral side. I speak more from, like, the clinical side of his diagnoses, and then also just trying to understand how this can kind of happen. All right. And so let's go on ahead and start with the first psychologist.
Please tell us your name.
Dr. Hyman Eisenstein.
You said Dr. Eisenstein. What is your profession?
I am a licensed clinical psychologist, PhD.
Do you have a specific area of psychology that is the primary focus of your employment?
I'm a clinical psychologist with a specialty in clinical neuropsychology and forensic neuropsychology.
Would you please tell the jury what neuropsychology is?
All right, so we're going to skip over that part where he's just talking about what neuropsychology is. So here is a close-up picture of Wade Wilson. As I mentioned, the details of this are just really bad, and he never once seemed like he cared at all, and no remorse. And he was actually pretty difficult with the second evaluator because he was evaluated by two people. I think this individual did the first evaluation, and then the second doctor that we'll hear from did his second evaluation. I do also just want to give the caveat that with the different diagnoses that are going to be described and that will be discussed, just because somebody has a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or any of those diagnoses, that does not mean that they are going to be harmful towards other people. Okay. So, this is one small segment of the most severe, and also adding in some personality features. So, a lot of individuals with those diagnoses, at times, they're more of a risk to themselves than to other people. And so, I really like to break that that stigma when we talk about these diagnoses. I did want to mention that this was the psychologist that Sarah Boone wanted. Mm, and I don't know that he could help her. Like he seems to be pretty balanced to me. I don't know if anybody could help her situation.
Basically interviewing individuals in terms of the background and connection affiliation with this particular case.
Okay. Did you have a chance to ever meet with Mr. Wilson?
Yes, I did.
How many times have you met with Mr. Wilson?
So I met with Mr. Wilson on 3 occasions, June 18th and 19th, for a total of 7 hours.
Okay. Were you able to obtain other background information pertaining to Mr. Wilson, such as jail records or other medical records?
Correct.
And do you know how many pages you had the opportunity to review?
Probably a lot.
There were hundreds and hundreds of pages from the Department of Correction, mental health, jail records that I reviewed.
Okay. And is there anything that you specifically recall at this time having read that indicated to you that Mr. Wilson may have mental health issues?
The records going back over 10 years were indicative that Mr. Wilson presented with numerous psychiatric, psychological symptomatology. He was on a variety of different psychotropic medications. They tried many, many medications. He currently
And I think he's talking about during his incarceration, they had tried multiple different medications, including antipsychotics. At this time of this hearing, he was on lithium, and at various points he had been on multiple different medications.
is on medication, lithium and Celexa. Both those are psychotropic medications.
What do you mean by psychotropic?
Psychotropic are medications that deal specifically with
Mental health.
major mental illness, either psychosis or depression or a combination of both. He's been treated for
Also, psychotropic can be anxiety, ADHD. It can be a wide variety of things.
these conditions for over 10 years, reflective in the records.
Do you recall any specific diagnoses, medical diagnoses?
He's been diagnosed with several different bipolar. He's been diagnosed with depression, anxiety. He's been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He's been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, adjustment disorder. There's a variety of different diagnoses.
An adjustment disorder is sometimes a diagnosis that's given, like if you're not really sure what's going on. So when somebody first comes into jail, if they're really struggling, then they might get an adjustment disorder because you don't necessarily know how they function before that. But based on what I've seen, I think that the diagnoses of antisocial personality disorder and then also bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. That's likely accurate. They're going to get into some of his childhood, and I wanted to talk specifically about adoption and adopting newborns and what people have to kind of watch out for in general. Because I think sometimes with adoption, people think if I adopt a newborn, they haven't experienced trauma, and adoption involves adoption trauma. And then also there are things that happen that where people have biological predispositions towards diagnoses. And there's also comments about maybe he was misdiagnosed, and personality disorders, it's all in the DSM-5, so that's why I clinically consider it all on that on but personality disorders are viewed differently, especially within the legal field within the legal spectrum, especially antisocial personality disorder, because that's not going to be a mitigating factor. Antisocial personality disorder isn't. And yeah, so let's keep going.
That have been offered in the records.
Okay. Did you have a chance to talk to, in enhancing your background information, did you have the opportunity to talk to any other individuals related to Mr. Wilson?
Yes.
And who was that?
So I spoke to his mother and father, Mr. Steve and Miss Candy Wilson. And I also spoke to his sister, his oldest sister, Dr. Wendy Wilson.
Okay. As a result of your conversations with these individuals, did you obtain any background information as to Wade Wilson that you felt was useful in reaching your ultimate diagnoses?
So Mr. Wilson was adopted by Steve and Candy Wilson almost after birth. Both the older sisters, Wendy and Whitney, are the biological daughters.
And so they've done studies. They've done a bunch of different studies that when a person is pregnant, that the stress, so if they are extremely stressed, that can increase the likelihood that the child might have some anxiety, might be predisposed to certain things. Cortisol, that stress hormone, it does cross that barrier, and so what the mom feels, the baby feels. And so an individual that is going to give a child up for adoption, I don't know. So his mother was 14 years old when she became pregnant. We don't know the circumstances of was that of like we don't know the circumstances of it. And with him then, because it seems like he had a pretty normal childhood. There wasn't anything that really spiked until adolescence. And with adoption, research has shown that adoptees enter therapy about as much as their same age peers until adolescence. We see a spike in, sorry, I hit my mic. You see a spike in a significant increase where adoptees are seeking more therapy typically. And often what I've found is that around adolescence, adoptees, especially ones that have known that about their adoption, and I do think it's important that kids know that. I don't think that should be a secret. Secrets when kids and people find out those family secrets, that can really be devastating to their identity. But sometimes they start to have these what ifs. Some things can kind of start to happen. He could have started experiencing some symptoms of mood dysregulation, or he might have started hanging with a different crowd. He might have started using substances. I don't know at what age he started using substances, and something could have happened. And now something happening to him would not justify anything that he did later. But sometimes I've worked with adoptees that have not felt completely a part of their family. He might have felt like the black sheep, and understandably, like because it sounds like he didn't have any problems, and then in adolescence he started having a lot of significant problems. Whew, all right, let's keep going, because I think he was the only one in the family that was adopted. I think the family had two other birth children, and I've worked with families where everyone in the family is adopted. I've worked with individuals that were adopted on their own, and I've also worked with adult adoptees that even into adulthood were still struggling with issues around loss and identity and feeling where they belonged, struggling with attachment and relationships into adulthood. So that's why I like talking about these topics.
Of Steve and Candy Wilson, and through a church gathering, they found out that Mr. Wilson's mother, biological mother, was 14 years old, had mental illness, had medical issues, and was unable to care for Wade Wilson.
And so I agree with Dr. G Explains talked about that Wade Wilson, I think he wants to project this "I don't care" attitude. I don't know if that's completely true. I don't know. Because Dr. G Explains said, because even like in how he makes himself have this perpetual kind of evil looking smile, sometimes you have to look really closely to see what his body language is actually saying and doing. So schizophrenia you can start seeing symptoms if a birth parent is the one that had the diagnosis. Sometimes onset can be a little bit earlier. And with him having both, possibly having both conditions, um, because they're saying he started to get more withdrawn. He started to, start to have more struggles. Academically, he had done well, and then around this time, he started to struggle. I compare that to somebody like Nicholas Cruz, who was also adopted. I think adopted and infancy as well. But I think he had issues like throughout his life, starting very early on. He had a lot of significant issues. All right, let's keep going.
Shortly thereafter,
Yeah.
they adopted him and became part of the family, the unit of the two older sisters and Mr. Wade Wilson, the youngest.
In Mr. Wilson's younger years,
I love y'all's questions. Okay. So, what's the difference between a psychologist and a forensic psychologist? So, the training can be similar because Dr. G Explains is a forensic psychologist. The individual speaking now, he's both a clinical and a forensic psychologist. And in my state, there's no licensure for forensic psychology. Forensic psychology is the study of like it's looking at people involved with the criminal justice system. So they often do capacity evaluations, competency evaluations. So competence to stand trial is the person mentally, like, do they understand who the judge is, who their lawyer is? Are they currently psychotic? Though that would be a reason why somebody could be found not competent to stand trial. They often do those evaluations for people not guilty by reason of insanity, that because there are private forensic psychologists and then there are public, so then there are people that work for the state, but for a state prison. In my state, it's often the state prisons or the mental health hospitals, normally the state mental health hospital that hires those individuals. In my state, Virginia, when somebody is found not guilty by reason of insanity, they go to the state hospital on their forensic unit. There's a special unit for those individuals because they often want to keep them away from the other parts of segments of the population because sometimes their unit is a lot more locked down. They're a higher security risk, and so sometimes that can be a little bit different. So forensic psychology, they're often individuals that have worked in jails, that meet with the jail population, that are aware of that criminology. They do additional training to be able to be a forensic expert. You can be board certified as a forensic psychologist. You can also be board certified as a clinical psych. As no, I don't think clinical. That might be. I don't know if that's an option. I know child psychologist is an option. There are a bunch of board certifications that people can do. It's a whole bunch of money. It wasn't worth it for me. I was able to build a successful practice without any board certifications. For medical doctors, they often have to get those certifications. So forensic is people involved with the jail system. Let me know if y'all have questions.
were there any, did they express any concerns about his mental health, or was he average?
So throughout his younger years up through puberty, he was functioning fine. He was active in sports. He was part of the family.
He went
And
to church?
he went to church on a regular basis. For the most,
How was he as a student?
he was a good student.
All right. What happened after puberty?
So they found they found that there was a dramatic change that occurred in puberty. His mental health changed. His behavior changed. He became reclusive, paranoid, mood swings, very aberrant behavior. He would sometimes think that there are aliens out to get him.
So the aliens part, that's what might point more towards. And with bipolar disorder, there can be a bipolar with psychotic features. And so distinguishing, is it psychotic episode of a manic episode, or is this a separate schizophrenia diagnosis? You often need an intensive assessment to rule out the two. You can also have both. There's something called schizoaffective disorder, where an individual experience psychosis, like those two things overlap, and there's a schizoaffective disorder. And I think we've talked about that a few times here on this channel.
Very concerned about the family, the parents, and he became very disruptive and very, very difficult to manage.
Did he start experimenting with controlled substances?
Yes.
And that can complicate this because there can be substance-induced psychosis as well. I worked with an individual that had a substance that was laced with another. They didn't realize it was laced with PCP, and they ended up with a psychotic disorder. And I didn't work with them long term, so I don't know if that ever resolved itself, or if that's something that individual will struggle with for the rest of their life. I'm not sure, but sometimes there can be substance induced psychosis as well.
What type of help did the family try and get for Wade Wilson when they first started noticing?
And his hate for women, that's where I wonder if he had unresolved adoption trauma of being abandoned by, or feeling however he felt towards his birth mother. And then how was his relationship with his adoptive mother as well? What was the process of him finding out about being adopted? I would have questions. So I'm a adoption competent therapist. And what that means is that I've done, I think it was somewhere around 20 to 30 additional training hours to talk about the impact of adoption throughout the lifespan and on the entire family, the impact on the birth family, the foster, adoptive, and across that individual's lifespan. How does adoption impact them? And that training was so, like, all therapists need that training, because my what I learned in school was not enough to be able to support these individuals. And I on my own would seek out, supports for how to help people with complex trauma and how to help all these other things. That adoption competency put it all within one training. And it's through adoptionsupport.org. It was a free certification, which was awesome. And I have their information linked down below if there are any licensed mental health professionals that want to look into their competency. They do cohorts, and it was an easy application process. I was accepted and did their training back in 2019 to 2020. I was a part of that cohort.
Seeing these behaviors.
So they tried to get mental health treatment. They sought out psychologists. Mr. Wilson was not cooperative and very difficult in terms of trying to get him the help that they sought. And unfortunately, it was only through the police, when his behavior became destructive, that intervention finally occurred.
There's a terminology in our system called the Baker Act, where people are involuntarily placed in a mental.
And so when he was 15 years old, he was involuntarily hospitalized.
Want him to perform, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And were you also familiar with Dr. Mark Mills?
Yes.
were you aware that Mr. Mills had gone in to see him before you?
Yes.
Because before.
Okay. You told us about the first test. Talk to me about the next test, please.
So on June 18th, I also performed the Dellis-Kaplan Executive Function System, the trail making test, 1 through 5. What is noteworthy on this test, and I think this is part of his mental status, how Mr. Wilson, how his mind works. He's very impulsive, he's very fast, and he has accuracy.
And I would wonder what the validity for that test was he just trying to rush through it? Because I think effort can play into that as well. Sometimes there is validity that's worked into these tests. I don't know that particular one because he's a neuropsychologist, so he does tests that dig deeper into the brain than I dig.
Beginning, but it very quickly waxes and wanes.
Okay. And so we do know that the jury, so this is a big replayed part. So let's just skip ahead a little bit, see what happens.
So the fact that a CT scan was performed so many times on him with multiple head injuries, we know that the CT scan is a measure which basically tells you whether or not there's any bones which are fractured and whether or not there's bleeding, but it doesn't go beyond that. And beyond that, there was no test performed. But again, to the extent that there were so many head injuries and there are so many CT scans that were performed over time, as I mentioned, there's certainly a history of synergistic effect of head injuries that Mr. Wilson suffered.
Okay, let's talk about that. I want to break that down a little bit because it's a lot of big talk, but I want to break that down. So you would agree that if somebody goes into the emergency room or emergency department, as it's now called, if they were to go in and say that they bumped their head, you would expect a CT scan would be performed. Would you not?
Depends on
Perhaps.
There are certain protocols that medical doctors would follow when there's a reported injury.
Okay. So I did just want to cover a little bit of the other doctor's testimony as well. Because this is Dr. Mills. He met with him as well. And it sounds like it was Dr. Mills and somebody else because Wade Wilson was more cooperative with the female than he was with the psychiatrist. So Dr. Mills is a psychiatrist and he went in to assess him. Yeah.
No,
And did you watch the video of the defendant's interaction with the officer?
No.
Don't you think that interaction might be important to gauge whether he was experiencing any hallucinations or delusions?
if one was only interested in his mental state at that moment, absolutely. If one's interested in his mental state more longitudinally over time, I don't think it would have made much difference. I mean, the evidence from my perspective is he's had serious mental illness for a long, long time. Whether it flared up in and around the time of these tragic events is a different question. And I don't have an opinion about that. I just believe that he is chronically mentally ill, chronically and severely.
Well, doctor, you indicated that you actually had a hard time getting information for this case because, number one, the defendant wasn't extremely cooperative.
Yes.
Number two, there weren't records outside the jail medical records. And you would agree, and you said, I think in your testimony, that the jail medical records had limited value.
So it sounds like he didn't get any type. Well, I guess at 15, maybe they weren't able to get those records from when he was 15 because records are only kept for 7 years, 5 years for adults, sometimes 5 to 7. It just depends. I wonder if they were unable to get those medical records from when he was 15.
Yes to all of that.
So, but you're saying that you didn't think the incidents or the situations surrounding the crime were that important for a diagnosis of schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder?
A diagnosis over the months and years of his life. That's correct. I mean, look, they are obviously directly relevant to what occurred here, and to the extent that had there been such strong evidence, this would have been, as I indicated, an insanity defense case. This is not an insanity defense case. The evidence apparently was very clear The jury deliberated and reached a conclusion relatively quickly.
Now, doctor, did you listen to a statement where he confessed to the murder?
And also, like, um the way that his face looks does not help his case. Now that should not contribute to bias of somebody's innocence or guilt. So I've one of my my husband follows the streamer Tim, the Tat Man, and Tim, like, he's running out of areas to tattoo. Like, he's a positive streamer on Twitch, on YouTube, and he just loves tattoos. And there's nothing, like, he doesn't have anything harmful. This guy seems to enjoy pushing the boundaries, enjoy seeing what he can get away with, doesn't seem to value other people. Like, there just seems to be a lot with him, and in my language we call it psychopathic behavior. It's that antisocial psychopath. But yes, because in my DSM-5 we don't have sociopath as a diagnosis, but in general when we're talking about psychopathic sociopathic traits, he definitely seems to be displaying all of that, and the jury found they did not find that any of this was a mitigating factor for him to not get the death penalty. And I'm sure the jury was thinking, because he picked his victims at random. Like, it wasn't like the women, I don't even think they rejected him, or like, it seemed like he just had this desire to do what he did, and he likely would have been a serial part. Like, he likely would have harmed more people, I think. I think he is a big risk and danger to the community, and I'm not surprised. His lawyer got permission, because there is makeup where they could have covered his tattoos, because his physical appearance could have caused the jury, could have added bias for the jury. I mean, it really could have. And so, but he refused. And that's where I think that's that antisocial part of, I'm going to do this my way. Like, F them. Forget all them. I don't care. This is a good question. Would love for you to discuss and analyze the term. Okay, so that's gonna have to be a whole nother video. So yeah, I don't, yeah. Wait a minute. Let me look it up. Is that when people are attracted to him or something? I see, and I can't even spell that one. Hybrid. mm, Okay. Okay. And so this is that sexual or romantic attraction to someone who commits crimes. And it exists. I don't know if I feel like it's the extreme of that bad boy syndrome, because I think people write Chris Watts, and people, I hope Chad Daybell doesn't have, I can't, but I think there are some Mormon women that might write, help. Sorry, I don't mean to say that derogatory, but like there might be some people that might think Chad Daybell might be, ugh, ugh. I get the ick from these people. Like, that is not what I personally am attracted to. But that it is something where people are attracted to that, and that can be a thing. Um, yes. And then how does recidivism factor into his mental health? We don't have to worry about that. He's going to get the death penalty unless something happens. He will have appeals. So with death penalty cases, there are automatic appeals. I don't know if he'll decline his appeals. I don't I don't know what he will do. All right. So I did want to shift to talk briefly about Sean Finnegan. Okay. So in 2019, Sean Finnegan and his girlfriend invited Jennifer Paxton to their home, and then they held her and they brutally, it was bad. Okay, very very bad things, and she ended up dying. The girlfriend cooperated in testifying against him, and um and his defense is going to kind of try to say he was fine before he met, or like that, almost, was it the victim that brought the sex toys, or was it his girlfriend? Like, his defense is going to try to blame it on anybody else except for him. And there's gonna be a childhood friend that's gonna talk about his history of childhood trauma. We're not gonna listen to all of it, but, I wanted to talk about childhood trauma and, him. Yeah. And this is a case where I think his attorney tried to clean him up as best he could. I know this isn't a real thing. He gives me weird, okay, good. He gives me like crazy eyes. Dead eye sadistic predator. Like he just gives and the jury probably felt a little bit of that too. I do feel like he was sadistic. So sadism is where people, and it's not like, because sometimes there's a kink where people just enjoy, where it's mutual. There are boundaries, there are safe words where people, within a little bit of kink, they just, they might enjoy certain things, but it's consensual and it's mutual. He seemed to enjoy inflicting pain on people that they did not want, to the point of them not being here anymore. And that's where, like, that's a problem. Okay. Um um Karen, I just want to highlight your voice. There is adoption trauma. As a child, will always want to know. And also, they want to know, like, why they were, even if people make this beautiful story of your parent loved you so much, they just couldn't take care of you. And so they picked us. Because sometimes with some adoptions, the birth parent is able to pick, like, or in some cases, DSS is involved. Um, and there are some people that in their adoption story, they do have where things turn out fine, and it's good. It's really good. I work with a lot of cases where there's a lot of trauma. And then sometimes people can be harmed in those adoptive homes as well. There's no evidence that that happened in the um my y'all know me in names, in the Watts case. There's no evidence of that at all. So, this one is so Rihanna, and I have the link to the full video down here. I don't even think I can read. So the title of this is Twisted. I don't hope I can say torture, murder trial. Like it was days. Her death was painful, and they harmed her in horrific ways. And so this is Sean Finnegan. I have the full link to everything he's done down in the description. Okay, I'm gonna fast forward to his childhood friend, who's just gonna talk about the person she knew.
Inappropriate.
Okay. So what about Mr. Sean Finnegan? Do you have any, like, when you first started dating his older brother, did you have any initial interactions with him or takeaways or memories?
Just that he might have been a little afraid and a little shy to come out and really be out there, as most families. I took it as just a new meeting, with the children, and children can be giddy because his other little brother and sister were also in the home, and they were your typical kids, but still.
Y'all know me and my ADHD. I can't stay on topic. Okay, anyone who needs someone who's on topic, Dr. G Explains is phenomenal. Okay, I love going live because we can have these conversations. Often open adoption, but the one thing I will say with an open adoption is the adoptive parents have to be comfortable with the love that the child has for the birth family. And I've seen that hurt the adoptive parents, but they have to do their own therapy. And I think pre-adoption therapy. So a child is not a cure for childlessness. So adoption does not cure that hole, that being unable to have a birth child felt. Like that person has to get their own help first. Okay? Because I've seen people think this baby is now going to fill me. This baby is now going to be all my wishes, wants, and desires. And then when that no longer happens, they want to give this child up like they're a puppy. And that is a child. Okay. And I get very, very, because I have, I'll be careful with what I say. Um, I know of situations where people have relinquished the adoptive parents. This child ends up not being exactly what they wanted, and additional trauma happens to that child because that adoptive parent gives them back to the state. In Virginia, that adoptive parent now owes child support to the state, and that like I don't tell them that. Like if people want to go through that process, I don't warn them of that. Uh, we try to avoid that at every single step of the way. My goal is always, can we make this work? What steps, what supports do you need? I will do everything I can, but adoption does not cure like the inability to have my own birth child. And I have a little bit of so I knew I work with adoptees, and if I had been unable to have my own child, because I struggled with conceiving a little, and but I knew I did not want to do. I personally wouldn't adopt because with adoption, you do not know what's going to happen. And I've seen people get so upset when that adopted child like hurts one of their birth children, or when that adopted child, that's what happened in the Timothy Ferreter. I think that was the dad for yeah, it was RF. That was the initials of the child. They ended up having like they adopted two, and then they ended up having two of their own, and then everything changed in my personal opinion. And so I'm very passionate about that. It's a whole thing. She's going to talk about her like how she knew him and all that.
Like what I would say, like, is if you were to stifle a child and not allow them to interact with guests, perhaps, go to your room, don't come out, kind of thing from his father.
Well, let's try to identify the children in order. So,
And so basically what she's going to bring up is that he had a history um of childhood trauma, physical, and then also SA. And the defense is going to try to introduce that as a mitigating factor, that things were fine for him before he connected with, like, they're almost going to kind of be like he wouldn't do this again. I don't know. The defense was going to try to say something. The jury did not buy it at all, because he ends up being convicted. He did not have a mental health evaluation, so there wasn't a psychologist or psychiatrist that came forward to say, hey, because of this childhood trauma, he has PTSD. And mm, and I don't know if he wouldn't allow that to happen. There's often a PSI, a report that's done to talk about their potential risk towards others, to talk about, do they feel remorse for the crime? There's often a PSI. I will tell you, I did not watch every second of it. And so for the Sean Finnegan one, uh, we are responsible for our healing. So nobody has a perfect childhood. Nobody. And no matter what happens, I'm responsible for my healing. And that's where I do my own work. I do my own therapy. Most therapists have their own histories of childhood stuff. Like, I don't know a single therapist that had a perfect childhood and was like, "Ooh, I want to help people." Like, most therapists have their own story. And so being able to heal and to do your own work, don't murder, like, just like those little things, like, no matter what happens, like, don't, consent is important, and all those things. Uh uh I also will just say, so I am pro adoption for people that are ready to adopt. Does that make sense? So people that are ready and willing to do the work. They know this is about the child. This is centered on the child. And no matter what happens, I am their forever family, including if this child one day says, they want to unalive me, or I don't know, but like I'm going to get them their help. Does that make sense? Like I'm going to do what I have to do just to support this child. If this child becomes unsafe towards other family members, I'm going to do what I need to do because I am committed to this child. They are a part of our family. And I'm never going to speak negatively about their birth family. I'm going to let them know that they're loved here. There are certain things that you just can't say to an adopted child. I've worked with people that have wanted to say, like, if you don't get it together, I'm gonna, you can't be a part of this family anymore. Or they say, act like you want to be a part of this family. Well, what if this child doesn't want to be a part of the family? Like that's not an option. They're in this family. Let's love and accept them. And so I do have a link for TBRI, trust-based relational intervention, because in order for trauma to heal, there has to be trust. That's step 1. You have to connect. You have to connect first. You can't discipline. Like, kids don't hear you if they don't know that you care. And I've worked with kiddos that I like to think of it like they didn't have a bottom on their cup. Like the parent could pour into them all day, and that child still didn't feel loved. And our work was to help that child feel loved. But in the midst of that, the parent had to pick and choose their battles. I don't care if the room is dirty. I don't care. I don't care if they're sneaking food at night. I don't care. Like, okay, so let's talk about safety. Now, if they're sneaking food to the point that they're like, like they're gorging and it's unsafe, then that's a whole other thing. But like, if they just want snacks at night, like let's put some snacks in their room. There are always issues around food. Like the people I work with, there are issues around food. There are issues around phones. So as they become teenagers, there are issues around boundaries around phones. And then there are all these other issues that come up. And we have to first have a relationship. And that's incredibly important. And so welcome to the Psych Nerds membership. I appreciate each and every sub. So thank you to every sub. Thank you to members. I appreciate you all. And with international adoptions, because some people think, "Ooh, do an international adoption." Different countries have different rules, and there are some countries that have stopped adopting to the United States because there have been so many like. So, ooh, is that a statistic? I have to look that up. I thought, um, number one cause of death for adoptees. I think it might be homicide. Let me see. I think it's unaliving self and homicide, I think. But um so there are significant things that can happen, and that's why, so I do dedicate myself to support adoptive families. And I agree, and I want to highlight your voice here, Ray of the Sun, that you are an adoptee, and even in a successful adoption there is trauma. I think all adoptees, especially transracial adoptees like myself, should be in therapy as a child. I agree. And I work with a lot of transracial adoptees, and sometimes the first step is I help the family with their hair. Step 1, if they need that help. Some families do not need that help. Some families do need that help. I encourage them to connect them with their community. I encourage them to connect them with their community. Because sometimes, so like if I'm just throwing it out there, if a white family adopts a black child, uh, that family may, like, they need to understand what that now means. There was a case, I forget what state it was in, but it was a white family that adopted a black boy, and he knocked on the wrong door. He was in his community. He knocked on the wrong door, and a neighbor unalived him. And that family was so just like, "Oh my god." Like, that family was like, they did not understand racism. They did not understand that they needed to teach their son, like, "Hey, you can't go up to every door." Like if you go up and knock, you need to leave their property. So I used to do home-based therapy, and I was very careful of my surroundings. I was very careful. My family knew where I was. Like they didn't know like exactly, but like this was before sharing location. But my boss would also know the areas that I would be in. But it's really important that people support families. And so I thank you all for joining me. If you want to hang out, we are going to talk about Robert. They say Tejas, because it looks like Tellus, but I think it's Tay. Y'all know me in names. But Robert out of Nevada, Las Vegas. We are gonna talk about his testimony, part two. It's a mess. We're gonna get into the cross examination. It's a mess. So just give me a few minutes and I'm going to start that stream next. Thank you all so much for joining me. I appreciate you all. Hey, Ray. I serve both military populations, so I am a TRICARE provider. I support our retired veterans and their families, and then also active duty. I grew up on Air Force bases, and so I've always had a connection to the military, and then also adoption. So my family has been impacted by adoption a lot. There are multiple members of my family that are in our family through adoption, and they are our forever family, and I think it's important that people know their story, that they understand things, and then that they're able to have that support. And thank y'all for y'all's time. I will see y'all in a second. Now, TRICARE pays. I'm sorry. Can I say this? I don't know. They're one of my lower payers, so TRICARE needs to pay me more, and I try to get them to pay me more, and they almost kicked me off their network. I was like, it was that last I forget what year it was. I know I was streaming on YouTube because I was like, I got mad at TRICARE and I asked for an increase, and all of a sudden all my claims got denied. I was able to get paid for those claims, but like it was a whole it was a whole issue. So I appreciate you all. I'll see y'all in just a moment. Bye.